We've got Brendan Anthony on the line from Mazodcast, talking Missouri football with a lot going on. We highlight the player movement, of course, the recruiting uh, period that's going to culminate here on the first Wednesday of February, and also the transfer portal that is factored in so heavily, but also some coaching movement because, of course, the coaches get fired. And so then they move on somewhere else. They have to be replaced, and then they take guys with them. And so it creates staffs in upheaval elsewhere, not so much in Missouri, but you do have some spots to fill on the defensive side.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the things that Barry Odom struggled with in his short tenure here at Missouri is that he's been unable to keep a lot of his staff either with internal strife or just non-production and sometimes because of success. Obviously, we had Heupel, who went to UCF after having a lot of success with Drew Lock in that offense here at Missouri, and when it was a fast-paced offense, he left to be a head coach. Of course, Derek Dooley filled in last year to become their offensive coordinator, and it probably answered some questions positively on how he would run that offense. But this year, there's been more stability than in the past, which is a good thing. One of the strange departures Missouri's dealt with is that Barry Odom's brother, Brian Odom, who was a defensive coach for linebackers, like I think outside linebackers coach, very specific job, and he left the program in this offseason to coach at Oklahoma. And the Odoms are all from Oklahoma. They're big Sooners fans. So to work for Lincoln Riley, I think, was a big opportunity for Brian Odom. But that meant that Barry Odom had to replace his own brother, and he has hired David Gibbs, who was a former Texas Tech defensive coordinator. And his position right now is defensive assistant, because I don't think they've quite worked out where he's going to fit into that defensive coaching strategy. But there is another hole that Odom has to fill with the loss of Joe John Finley, who was their tight ends coach, and he left to take a role on the Texas A&M coaching staff. So there's still a little looking around to do, but it's a lot less turmoil than some programs are dealing with, and it's certainly less than what Barry Odom's had to deal with in the last few off seasons.
2018 turned out to be a pretty good season. There was a bit of a slump there at the end of Gary Pinkel's run, leading into Barry Odom after the 2 division championships. And a fine season 2 years ago, getting to the Texas Bowl somewhat unexpectedly, building off of that with a better record this past season. Your thoughts about what was accomplished in 2018? Another bowl loss, however, and this time as a pretty big favorite against Oklahoma State, and then projecting toward 2019. Where does the program sit?
So it's been interesting with Barry Odom. The things he's been doing have, you can look at it on paper and say, there's no question it's positive. I think he took over a 4-8 team, or, he had a 4-8 team, and then a 7-win team, and now an 8-win team. It's moving in the right direction. Fans have been up and down about Coach Odom throughout his tenure. I think part of it is that he's a first-time head coach, not just at Missouri, not just in the SEC, but anywhere. He was an assistant before coming in to become a head coach here at Mizzou, and there have been a lot of growing pains, a lot of mistakes. I mentioned some of keeping his staff going, with defensive, offensive coordinators in and out the door, but some on-the-field coaching decisions that have been questioned. And then the last year, you mentioned sort of the surprise winning season that took us to the Texas Bowl. We were doing horribly. We had lost like 5 games in a row, and then we went on this 6-game winning streak to end the season. The schedule made that somewhat favorable for Mizzou. It was front-loaded, but they took care of business down the stretch and got themselves to a bowl game. So people had a lot of optimism going into the end of that season, even though we did lose to Texas in the Texas Bowl. This year, we looked at the schedule, and here locally, we had a lot of optimism for Mizzou because they were bringing back a lot of the stuff that was helping them down the stretch last season. There weren't a lot of departures, particularly on offense. And so, we thought an 8-9-win season was not out of the question. And I think a lot of the national media had us more repeating what we did last year with a 7-win season. We did win 8 and had a good, easy chance at 9, but even more to Mizzou fans' displeasure was that there were a couple of games that Missouri, frankly, just gave away. Actually, 3 games, if you count that Liberty Bowl we lost against Oklahoma State in a very winnable circumstance and coaching question marks. led to that defeat, and that stuck in a lot of Mizzou fans' craw. But they also gave a game away against Kentucky, and they gave a game away against South Carolina down to the final minute. It was one of those games that the last guy with the ball wins. In Missouri, they really had some questionable coaching stuff to lose us 3 games to a twin. What was an 8-win season could very easily have been an 11-win season. I know that probably sounds crazy to people, but you look at the way those games unfolded, and that's exactly where they were. And so even though things are moving in the right direction, if you look at a 3-year span, a lot of people are upset with the way the season ended, and the fact that Barry Odom, even though he's had success, he always ends the season on a big disappointment. We have not won our final game in his entire time we've been there, and it's you want to take some momentum into the offseason, and we haven't managed to do that yet. So Barry Odom, he's not on the hot seat. He certainly shouldn't be on the hot seat, but people are still reserving judgment ultimately on whether he's the right guy for the job, because he just got to get us over that hump, whether it's in the recruiting front, in the bowl game front, and just in some way, we've got to have a signature win. And so far, that has been beating Florida in the Swamp this year, which was not expected. But they didn't just beat Florida. They looked like they dominated Florida. And more games like that, and Barry Odom will secure his role here for years to come.
Yeah, you stole my transition, but yeah, that certainly stood out as the marquee win of the season, going to the Swamp, winning by 21 points against a team that eventually, although not quite as regarded at that point as they eventually would be, did run the table after that and beat Michigan in a bowl game to finish in the top 10 in the country, a 10-3 team there at Florida. The Kentucky game really stood out to me because that was a game in which I locked into it late in the game, and Kentucky could do, as was the case a number of times this year, relying on its defense, could do little on offense. And I believe he had a muffed punt, or they had some kind of big punt return for a touchdown after they were down like 14-3, something in that range. And then they, for the one time the entire game, when they got the ball last, they finally moved it, and then they score after the game was over, and they get the penalty and the untimed down, and then they beat you 15-14.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people that thought the penalty was a poor call, and there were some things that went against Missouri from an officiating standpoint, but in those tight games there always are. And that was a real punch in the gut, and that was the low point in the season. And that was a lot of people were calling for Barry Odom's head, because Kentucky was highly ranked at that time and were highly regarded. And Missouri, frankly, in the first half outplayed them dramatically. We struggled to get the ball into the end zone, however, where you let drives stall out in the red zone. And then in the second half, something crazy went on, and Missouri did not get a first down the entire second half. So literally, if Missouri would just been able to punch the ball in one more time in the second half, they would have won that game without any fears. But a special teams error, and then the defense, frankly, just getting tired, because Missouri's defense had kept Kentucky out of the end zone the entire game until after the game had ended, like I said, on an untimed down. So it was a bizarre game, and it was just one of those games where your team let the game get away. Kentucky didn't win that game. Missouri lost it. And frankly, I think the same thing could have been said against South Carolina, where there was a third quarter monsoon that struck in Columbia, South Carolina, and then the entire tenor of the game changed after that. We had a few mistakes, a few bad calls, and we blew the game. We should have won. We blew the game. And so those are the kind of things that Missouri fans are remembering, rather than the 8-4 winning season.
Hey, Brendan, all that said, you're working on a season number 8 in the SEC. So I'm going to have you estimate something here. I just went through the records. I probably could have come extremely close, but wanted to double check my work. So I went through the records. So in 90 games in the SEC, 90 games overall, 52-38. So that would be 56 games in the SEC, 8 per season. Of course, 7 seasons. What do you think Missouri's record is in conference? 56 games.
So it will be weird, because we've had seasons where there was one year we were one game away from being undefeated in conference.
2, actually.
And then we've had seasons where we had a season where we were winless in conference, I believe, or at least one win.
1-7.
1-7. That was a low. Yeah, I'm thinking of Tennessee. They go winless in conference, not us. So I would have to guess it would be around 500, maybe slightly better than 500.
27-29. You're right there.
So a little slightly worse than 500. Yeah. Yeah, we
So,
would do.
so how has life been in the SEC? Is what I'm
So
getting to.
yeah, I think it's been a mixed bag, and I think it's Missouri has done the same thing in the SEC that they did in the Big 12, and I don't think that a lot of SEC teams knew much about Missouri when they were in the Big 12. But we are a roller coaster team. We're going to have terrible years, and we're going to have great years. We're like a wild stock that you don't want to buy. There are a lot of teams I think that are overall the records may be similar to Missouri, but they're going to have maybe 8-4, 7-5 wins seasons every year. Well, we're going to have our 4-8 seasons and our 3-9 seasons, but we're also going to go 11-1, and that we have done that a number of times in the last 15 years. So our ceiling is higher, but our floor is lower than a lot of programs, and I don't think that has changed by being in the conference at all. I think we've done the same thing in the Big 12 as we've done in the SEC, and I also think it's a product of the conference itself to some degree, because you look at the SEC and there are a lot of winnable game opportunities there. You see Vanderbilt and Kentucky, Missouri feels like they should beat those schools every year. I know that they don't, and a lot of teams scoff at that, but they should. And then there are other places like Tennessee where we have had our way with Tennessee and Florida. Frankly, if you look at our overall head-to-head record, we have had no problem with those two supposed power schools, but we have really struggled with the West teams other than Arkansas, which we do play every year. But Alabama, we get blown out. LSU, we get blown out. We played Mississippi State, we got blown out. When we've played these Western Division schools, we have not performed too well. And I used Arkansas as the exception, but our first couple of years in the SEC, we played A&M, and we had success against A&M as well. We were familiar with them. But I think Missouri has done better than what other SEC fans would have expected from Mizzou, but I think it's been below our expectations other than our 2 East Division champion years. This is a season, for instance, that we played below expectations, and we should have been in contention, if not against Georgia for the East, for that second place spot, just behind Georgia in a New Year's Six Bowl. They didn't get there. A lot of it was on coaching, but they had the talent to. And frankly, I think a lot of fans think next year with Kelly Bryant, if he makes the transition well, they should be a tough team to beat.
Brendan Anthony, talking Missouri football, recruiting, coaching changes, and life in the SEC. You can catch Brendan and the rest of the crew there at MazodCast. One more time, Brendan, where can we find you?
Yeah, like I said, we're very active on social media, on Twitter or on Instagram at MazodCast. iTunes is where we get most of our downloads, but Spotify and Google Play, Stitcher have been very common as well, SoundCloud, you name it. I think the easiest thing, if you are interested in listening about Mizzou football, you can go to our website at MazodCast.com, and we have links to everywhere you can hear the show, as well as articles we want to put out there into the world as well.
And to your point, Brendan, you are 4-2 the last 6 years against the Florida Gators.
That's right. Yeah,
there it is.
And this year, I don't think Missouri fans were that surprised to beat them. We beat them I think maybe by the same score. No, that was Tennessee. We beat them by the same score twice in a row. But we blew out Florida 2 years in a row. So we're not that surprised by it. And I don't think that's going to be a trend that continues. I think they are a program headed in the right direction. They're going to be tougher and tougher, but they have struggled against Missouri, and I think Florida fans will tell you that.
All right, Brendan. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Mark.